following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
And yeah, what are you working on? Cool. Like, yeah, I'm doing the project, and actually showed me the pitch deck for the graph.
We're like astronauts, floating in the space of time, lost between the past and future.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Rodrigo Coelho, Chief Spirit Officer at Edge and Node. This is part one of a two-part series we recorded at the House of Web3 in San Francisco, California, during the Graph's recent third birthday celebration. You can watch a video recording of this interview on the House of Web3's YouTube channel, and I want to apologize in advance for some of the audio issues. Some parts of the interview are difficult to hear. If you've been around the Graph ecosystem for a while, then you already recognize Rodrigo. Rodrigo was the first hire that Yaniv, Brandon, and Jannis made when they started working on the Graph, and since that time, Rodrigo's been instrumental in growing the Graph ecosystem and community. During part one, Rodrigo talks about his background and several experiences and challenges he faced early in his life to help shape his life and ultimately lead him to Web3 and his present role at Edge and Node. Next week, during part two, Rodrigo talks about meeting Yaniv and going to work on the Graph after meeting Yaniv at a co-working space in San Francisco, what it was like being employee number one, what those early days were like, and some fun stories, and a lot more. I've wanted to interview Rodrigo for a very long time, so I appreciate the time he gave me, as well as the House of Web3 for providing the space and equipment to record this interview.
So, Rodrigo, first of all, this is incredibly cool. I've been hunting you down for a long time for this interview, and that'll become apparent in a minute why I've been trying to get this interview for a long time. But we should let listeners know that we're doing this recorded at the House of Web3. So this is going to be made available by video as well as audio. So super exciting. So first and foremost, shout out to the House of Web3 team for having us here and letting us shoot this podcast. The reason why I've been wanting to interview you for so long is you were employee number one within the Graph ecosystem at Edge and Node now, and we got a lot to talk about. People want to go back in time and hear all about this. Before we do any of that, though, let's get to know you a little bit. Where are you from?
Originally born in Brazil, and we basically moved to the United States when I was like a baby. Basically, my dad was a doctor, my mom was a nurse. Brother had come to the States, and his brother was a physicist, and he's like, "You need to come." And so he came out, I think San Francisco first, if I recall correctly. Liked it, came back, and then we came out. But the intention was never to stay. It was going to be like a few month thing. And then we ended up staying. So really, it's really interesting that like one of these key decisions changes the trajectory of life. So had my parents decided, no, let's go back to Brazil. I mean, where would I be today? Like One of those sliding door moments. And so we like moved to LA, and then we moved to Houston and then Toronto. And then we landed in Phoenix, Arizona. So I was there from, I think it was around first grade, and spent the bulk of my life there. So I went through schooling. And one thing I want to mention about that kind of era of my life is, so, I have this Brazilian name, Rodrigo Coelho. And so like being a young kid, it was always hard for kids to say like Rodrigo, and they'd like tease me. So for like fun fact, like a lot of my life, I can't remember how the moniker came, but people called me Ricky, like growing up.
Amazing.
Yeah. I was like, Ricky Ricardo, Ricky, like imagine like, elementary school age, Ricky Ricardo. And so also like, I was sort of like a person without like a home, I guess. So at home, it was like we spoke Portuguese. It was Brazilian food, Brazilian culture. We responded in English. And then, I'm in like Arizona, which is kind of like suburbia, and I played soccer. I didn't play like football or baseball. So I never felt like, one of the guys, or, I always felt like this kind of outsider in a way. And it was like, where do I exist in this world? So I had that experience kind of growing up, although, it was a great childhood and had friends and whatnot and made my way. And then when I think it was around like high school or maybe freshman year in college, went back to Brazil and spent a good amount of time there. We had gone a few times to visit family through my childhood. But then I really reconnected with like the Brazilian aspect of me. And that was when I was like, okay, I'm going to go by Rodrigo now. And like, oh, when I was there, wow, this is really like who I am and part of my identity that I'd sort of, put on the back burner, I guess, or hadn't really explored. So, I made a real effort to like speak Portuguese more and like really go back to my roots. And like, so yeah, in a way I've sort of integrated both of those things now because like, for example, like when I speak to Brazilians, they're like, oh, you're not Brazilian. You have an American accent or da da da. And then Americans are like, well, you're, it's like this. Yeah. So I had that experience, through my childhood and life. And that was like defining, I guess, like part of my identity and who I was.
So you talk about struggling to kind of connect. As you said, you weren't
Yeah.
part of the group until you reconnected with your roots. What are the artifacts as an adult of growing up that way? I mean, does that make you more open to experiences? Does it make you a little bit reserved on certain things? Like, how does that manifest?
Yeah. So I do appreciate that background for, I feel like I'm more worldly. So when I go to Europe, for example, I really connect more there. And I was like, gosh, if I had like grown up instead of Phoenix, but like a more metropolitan, global city like Paris or Rome or New York or something where there was like people from many different cultures and whatnot, I was like, wow, I would have felt way more like I fit in there. But it's also made me, definitely more open to lots of different perspectives too, because I wasn't like, tied to like, okay, I'm like isolationist in a way of like, I have this culture and whatnot. I was sort of split between two.
Right.
So I got to see the aspects of both. And then subsequently in my later years, I did spend time like, visiting other cultures, but like studying different religions. There was a period in my life where I went through a lot of like reading spiritual texts. We'll get into later, but so I looked into and explored many different avenues. So it has made me more open and interested in like many cultures. I'm a student of language. Like I speak 5 languages. And like so I really enjoy that aspect of like etymology too, like the roots of words I find really interesting because, growing up, when you have a different language background, you start to see, especially with the Romance languages and Latin, like where kind of words come from. And that really fascinates me of like, oh, historically, like a word was used this way and then it metamorphosized into something else. Or I have a interesting little tidbit on that. So the word Rodrigo, doing the etymology on that was that in Old Spanish, the word to rodrigar something it's like the stick you put next to a sapling tree to like hold it while it grows, right? So that was interesting.
It is interesting.
And then my last name, Coelho, is actually the word for rabbit. So I think like historically there was, I think it was a similar thing. Like maybe I have a Jewish heritage, like way back when, I'm not sure, that I think there were people when they moved into Portugal took on names of like animals and plants, like when they changed their names. I think that is the backstory on the in Coelho. but it's a very popular name in Brazil and Portugal. It's like Smith almost. There's like tons of Coelhos, and I get asked all the time, like, are you related to Paulo Coelho? Like The Alchemist, like, it's sold 100 million copies.
Yeah.
Everyone's read that book. I get asked all the time, like, you related to Paulo Coelho? And I'm like, I wish.
Well, that book's come up a lot on this podcast.
Oh, really?
And I'll be very intrigued to hear your GRT IQ 10 based on your background and a lot of these different interests. But let's jump forward just a little bit here and kind of land in university, which is a typical question where I start the podcast. But what can you tell us about your educational background, what you ended up deciding to study?
So, I tell this a lot is that Arizona I never felt like truly connected to it. And so I've always had been wanting to like leave it multiple times. And one of those times was going to university. I'd originally intended to go, to another school. And part of my upbringing was like, my parents were immigrants. And so they didn't know like anything about how to, I didn't have like college, like prep tutors or like counselors, like, here's what you should do. I had to figure it all myself. I was like, oh, I got to do the SAT, and I had to study it myself. Kids these days have like it all lined up for them, but no, I had to go to the library, literally get like an SAT book out of the library, like do practice tests on my own, like time it, take it, and take the test multiple times. I scored really well. And so as a result of a really high score at that time, so I had gotten into like really good schools, but it was going to cost me a lot of money. But then ASU like actually sent me a letter like, hey, you want to come here? We've started this honors college, give you a full ride. We're actually going to give you all this tuition. And dating myself a little bit here, but like college back then was like $1,500 a semester, I think. Right. Yeah, that's not like ASU back then was I want to say $1,500, $2,500. It was ridiculous. So anyway, they're like, we'll ride, National Merit Scholar, like we'll get you a door, like everything's taken care of. And so I ended up choosing to go there because like they offered this sort of small liberal arts experience within like, big school. So they had like professors that had come from like top universities and were teaching there, and it was like a humanities focus. And they had kids graduating there that were like Fulbright scholars, Rhodes scholars. So they had a real like emphasis on that. And I ended up going there and spent a summer abroad, through the honors college program. And so I think for me, it was like a good choice because I realized that it's, where you make it, where you go in college is sort of like you make the most of it. And so I really feel like I made the most of it. And so I studied industrial engineering. At the time, I wasn't quite sure directionally where I wanted to go. And at that time, I was thinking I was going to go into like management consulting. And then was considering grad school. I'd apply, like took GMAT, got into schools again, wanting to leave Arizona. And I had a really good friend, classmate. Senior year, he started to like work at this financial firm, and he was like doing consulting work. I was sort of figuring out what I was going to do, and he was starting to see at that time, like, wow, there's a real opportunity here in sort of bringing like business processes to the internet that was just like fledgling at that time. This was like 97. So businesses at that time were really interested in taking what were paper processes and faxing and whatnot and streamlining those. And so he was already seeing as a consultant in his experience there as like a contractor, the amount of work that just in this one financial company was needed. And he's like, we could like start to, do something here. And we had a class project together that was actually building like a database for a video store. Like Blockbuster, right? Yeah. Like back when you'd go into a store, sure. And like
young people like, won't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, young people. Sorry. Yeah. So like so I learned SQL in that class, and that was like one of the great things I got out of college is I learned SQL, which has been like really valuable even today. in what we're doing with the graph and like understanding databases. So that was like fundamental, I think. And I encourage everyone to like learn SQL or like learn that because it helps you understand like tables of data and relationships and everything flows from that. Like if you think about it, every user interface we use today is like a user interface onto a database, Yeah. And you're scrolling Twitter, like at the end of the day, it ends up in a database. And like Excel is sort of like a database interface on a database, a spreadsheet. But so we had this like class project. We crushed it. We blew everyone away. Like when we did our presentation class, we had it like, we did a demo and people were like, what? No one else in the class like went as far as we did. And we're like, we have a knack for this. We're like, we should do it. So he and I said, let's start. So I opted, instead of going to grad school, I was like, hey, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and like start this thing. So he and I, we started working out of like his little apartment, and it was like a tiny room, and it was like hot and sweaty because we had like computers in there. And we got our first project, and it was to develop. One thing was like a retirement calculator we did for like Oppenheimer funds, which I don't know if they're still around, but
so you're kind of putting in your age, how much you got, how much you're going to invest in.
Yeah. And it was like this online, like web-based calculator. You were like, you go on Netscape or Internet Explorer. Like it was, that was the era we were doing it. And then, we ended up doing work for the financial company, and it ended up, so it was called Intoflux, and we ended up like hiring, I want to say it was around 30 people. And this was before offshoring became a thing. So we hired a lot of like college, like first we had our friends who we'd graduated with in engineering, and then it was sort of like more local back then. So we all learned to code. So I started out coding. Back in the day, it was Cold Fusion, which was a language that's not around anymore. And interestingly, that Cold Fusion was started by, I think it was Jeremy Allaire, who's now the founder of Circle.
Oh,
yeah. So he goes way back, to that era. I think he started like Macromedia, which was bought by Adobe, and then he did this Fusion. So we were programming in this language Cold Fusion, which also gave me the background understanding now of like front end development and sort of how web development and app development works. So I have this way prior knowledge, and languages moved on from them, but the fundamentals are still there. Having done it myself and building user interfaces and like connecting to the database, bringing the data in, showing it, displaying it, interacting with the database. So that was a wonderful experience. And that was from like 1997 to 2001. And in fact, we had sold the business like literally like 4 months before the .com crash.
Oh, yeah. Good timing.
Yeah. So we like got out of that. And then my life took a turn for an interesting turn there. So I had just sold the company. I was like, thought I was the bomb.com, right? I'm like, I think I was, I was probably 26 at the time. So let me just rewind a little, getting into this part. So like during the stint during my company, I was dating this Colombian water skier, and she was like competitive, like did slalom and jump and everything. And she was training at this camp in Barstow, California. And I was like, she's like, come out and visit and we can water ski. And I was starting to like go out and water ski a lot. I was doing slalom. I was like getting pretty good at it. She's like, you should try the ramp. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll try the ramp. And like, they didn't set the ramp like for my first time.
Yeah.
They didn't like put it on baby level. They didn't go slow. They went like full tilt ramp, full tilt speed. And mind you, I had the full like wetsuit on and like this belt. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do the helmet. I was like, yeah. And so we go and do it. And the first, like you're going towards this ramp at like 32 or 36 miles an hour. And from the water, it looks like a wall, like you're coming at. I'm like, So I like chickened out the first time. I was like, that is scary. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. Second time I go, they gave me no instruction. Like that's another thing. It was like, here's what you're going to do. You're going to do this. No, it was
It's
just
like taking
oh,
an SAT all over again.
Yeah.
Just
it was
show
like,
up
just
and
do
figure
it.
out.
So we go around, I go, and I get on it. And they didn't explain to me that like the friction on the ramp is like ice compared to the water. Like it's slick. And so basically I hit the ramp and my feet went out from under me, fly through the air, and I land like on my side. And I literally felt like I'd snapped in half backwards. And like, I felt like I broke my back. I was like floating in the water, like, oh my God, like I'm so screwed. And I wiggled my toes and I was like, okay, like I'm not paralyzed. Cause I literally, the pain in my midsection was like, and so they like pull me out of the boat, drag me to shore. And I'm like trying to catch my breath and like sitting up. I was literally about to pass out and I lay down. And I was like, guys, I'm not good. And we're like way far away from, we're in Barstow and it was like far. I was like, you need to call an ambulance. Like, I don't know what's going on. I was like about to pass out, shivering. And so like, I don't know how long it was, 45 minutes, ambulance comes, they take me to, 45 minutes hospital. I'm there trying to figure out what's going on, CAT scan. And then they're like, you ruptured your spleen. And so like your spleen is like right here and it's like a major. And so 2 hours have passed. Now they had to wait to get a CAT scan guy in and wait hours. So imagine like cutting your arm, like a major, and just bleeding. So I'm bleeding for hours, right? And I'm starting to like slip away. And I didn't know this I do remember like, they're like, you should call your parents. Called home and I'm sort of like in and out. And my dad gets on the phone. I'm like, Dad, I ruptured my spleen. He was like, no. It was like the scream heard around the world. You're
Wow.
like, no.
And he's a doctor. He
knew how serious it was. And they were like, we're getting in the car right now. And they like drove. They didn't think I was going to make it. And so, yeah, I literally started to like drift. So I was kind of in the bardo, like floating above and they had to wait for the doc. It was like a Saturday and all this time waiting and I'm just bleeding like literally into my like intestinal cavity, bleeding. And, so I had this experience of total, like this was my first like kind of really in-depth spiritual experience of just like, there was literally no fear, nothing to worry about. It was like pleasant. I didn't have like the tunnel experience or anything, but it was definitely like I was in between. And then, slam back to reality and wake up and I'm like tubes and like, and it was like the next day or whatever. I was like, and so, yeah, like recovered from that. And, so I tell that part because, going back to what I was saying, we sold the company. It was like 2002. I'm like on top of the world and, I'm out on a like weekend, my girlfriend at the time trip in LA and I get this intense stomach. It's like 4 years later. And so, literally in the night, it was like wrenching pain, like low abdomen. I was like rocking and I'm like, this is not getting better. And I'm like, I need to go to the emergency. Like when the sun came up, I was in the worst pain of my life. Go to the emergency room there. They thought I had a stomach ache. They're like, are you sure? They thought I was faking it, but I'm like, no, this is serious. I had to like force them to do like a CAT scan. They're like, they did a blood test, urine test, or like, we don't see anything. They're like wanting to send me home. I'm like, no, this is like the worst pain ever. So I had to basically insist to get like a CAT scan again because I'd had one before. And I was like, something's not right. I wait hours and then they're like, sorry, there's no radiologist here to read your results. You're going to have to go home. And I'm like, are you kidding me? At that point, I'd been there like half the day, like 6 or 8 hours. I'm like, this is insane. So I was so frustrated. I should have insisted at that point to like get something read, but I was young. I didn't know any time at the time. Came back, drove back to Phoenix, pain, and then the pain was getting worse and worse and worse. And like, I had learned this trick from like, I'd been into yoga at the time. And one of the cleansing things they do is you drink like a warm glass of water with like a ton of salt in it as a means to like flush everything out. So I was like, I'm going to try that because I hadn't had a bowel movement in days. I'm like, something's wrong. So I took it, and then that like ramped up the pain to like level 100 because basically it was trying to push. And what happened was I had an intestinal blockage of volvulus. Yeah. So, so then, it got worse and worse. I had to go back to the emergency room again. And then they were, I said, you've got to send the results. I told them I'd gotten a CAT scan days before. So they get the results from the California hospital. And they're like, you need to go into surgery like now. Like what?
Another very
like this is serious. Like your intestine was like the size of a football and it was about to rupture. If it did, like you get sepsis and die. Very serious. They were like rushing to surgery. And that was like the last thing I remember before waking up a month later.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So basically, what happened was my intestine twisted probably as a result of like the first spleen surgery, because they have to go in there and move everything around. Like your intestines are like tight in there. So they close everything up. And I was doing yoga and twisting a lot. And it's kind of, they don't have a real reason, but basically like my small intestine like kinked, like as if you were, blowing like a balloon animal.
Yeah.
Kinked like that. And so it was blocked, and days had passed, which made it like really serious. So they go in surgery, they cut, a piece of the intestine and like put it back together, and they're like, he's going to be fine. Well, in post-op was not fine. And fortunately, like my dad being a doctor saved my life really. Cause he had actually worked at the hospital before, and he went in to see me. Like they normally wouldn't let family go into post-op when you're recovering. He goes in because I hadn't come out in hours. He's like, what's going on with my son? And he like reads my charts and he's like, oh my God, so he sounded the alarm because basically my oxygen levels in my brain were super low. So what had happened was apparently I'd gotten a blood clot, and my intestine was swelling, and my lungs, it was pushing into my lungs. I wasn't breathing fully. And so like my blood oxygen level was way low. So because of him, they sprung into action. Like they had to take me to emergency surgery again. They opened me up. This I found out later. They had gone in, and a new doctor had come in because the other doctor had left. And basically my entire intestine was black, like gangrene. So basically like when your flesh starts to die, it turns black. So my entire intestine was like black. And the guy told me later, like he said, I had a decision at that point. Like I literally could have cut your entire intestine out because it was dead. He's like, no, he's young. I'm going to, we're going to undo the thing, cut a little more here and leave it apart and leave it open. And like, let's see if it recovers. Cause maybe it was like, let the blood thing, and maybe the blood supply will like get it back to life. So that was another like sliding moment where one person's decision like could have changed. Yeah. Like I could have literally been fed intravenously just my life. So that was like a saving grace there. So I basically, they intubated me and put me in this sort of like drug-induced coma for a month. I had my intestine open, and they had to go in for like 4 more surgeries to like cut out more, make sure it was okay. So they ended up cutting out like subsequently more each time. And they ended up cutting like 3 feet out of my intestine. Unfortunately, I have like 30 or so. So like the end of my small intestine and like my ascending colon. So I still have like transverse and what. And then they left it separated, and I had like an ostomy, or I ended up having to have that for like 9 months. And while they let it heal, and like talk about a humbling experience, right? You go from like top of the world, right, smack down, and just like flat. And like, I also had experiences during my like coma period where I was like, I mean, it's kind of out there, but I've had like past life experiences. So one, I was literally like in a military hospital in World War II, and I could hear like the boots of the guy walking the hall, and I like my legs had been like blown or something. And I was laying there and thinking to myself, like, I am screwed. Like, I'm not getting out of this. But I heard like, German speaking, and there were, a couple other flashes of like different lifetimes, which was just so bizarre. So yeah, I came out of that and like, I had an ostomy. So, it was crazy. Like I had to, a drink, and like within like 20 minutes it would start like spurting out.
Yeah, that's wild.
It was crazy. And like, it's so humbling. Right. And so you take health, we take it for granted, but I was like, people have to live with this their whole lives. And, I had that experience of like being fully humbled by life, being like here to just like wiped out, and I had to build myself back. And then, so they corrected everything and sewed it back together after 9 months. But it took, I weighed like 120 pounds at the time. I was like, and I couldn't get enough nutrition because your intestines, like they weren't absorbing. And I was fed intravenously every night. I'd have this like bag of liquid food basically. And, so at that point, after the 9 months recovered, and it was during this period of time that I mentioned earlier that where I read like, over the course of like a couple of years, like read 1,000 books, like all these spiritual texts. I was really like exploring that aspect of my life.
Are you doing that to understand the experiences you had, or are you doing that because you had this paradigm change where you thought there was some more fragility to life that maybe your younger self didn't understand?
Yeah, it was a bit of both. It was an attempt to sort of, bring context to like the experiences I had had, and, build language around it. And it was interesting to me because I started to see that through all these different texts and different cultures, and it was all pointing to the same thing. And so, I felt like, it was a time of really like unifying that experience to me and putting like the languaging around it. And so, that was a really transformational time. And then from that point is where I started the next business I worked on, which was called the Core Book. And my ex and I were partners on it. She was a model turned photographer, and she had handmade one of these books for one of her clients, like a coffee table book. And at the time, like all you could get were like wedding type of photo albums. And her idea was to make like the type of published book like you'd buy at a bookstore, like, a Tom Ford coffee table book, but that you could do one off. And this was like, this was early days. Shutterfly wasn't even around at that time. And like HP had come out with these new printing presses called the Indigo that allowed for you to do like offset quality printing kind of one off. And so we were early in that space and built this kind of tour book where we were working with professional photographers, and they would make these books for like portfolios for weddings. Yeah. And so she and I ran that for many years, and out of Arizona. Yeah, I did that until 2016. Sold that. And then subsequent to that, so the college classmate I had met, which I started the first company with, we had sort of been in contact and had this idea for building. So this was like pre kind of Signal and everything, but it was like an encrypted communication platform. And so it was called C-Suite. We started working on that. And that's what got me kind of out to San Francisco. So I was in Phoenix at the time. My relationship was kind of coming to an end. And so I wanted to like get a new change of scenery. I'd been in Phoenix, for all this time. And I was, again, like I'd been wanting to leave. I'd been wanting to come to Bay Area for a long time. And so, I sort of like looked on a map and like, where should I go next? And like looked at Boulder and Austin, like where is the startup scene? And so I ended up on San Francisco. And so, yeah, I moved the headquarters here, worked on that. And this is part of like the tale is I'm working in a co-working space called Galvanize in Soma in San Francisco. And it was around Christmas time of 2017. I happened to see this guy with like a Ethereum Christmas sweater on. And I was like, hey, and I had been interested in crypto for a while. I'd been following Bitcoin since like pizza time. And so, yeah, I struck up a conversation like, hey, you're into crypto. And this was like 2017, not a lot of, here we have House of Web3 and like there's all around. Back then it was like a unicorn.
Yeah,
like
still very early.
It was early days. So we struck up a conversation and yeah, what are you working on? What are you working on? Cool. He's like, yeah, I'm doing this project and actually showed me the pitch deck for the graph.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. So he was working on the deck and I was like, wow. And I could see immediately like this was a massive idea. This is huge. And you could tell he was really like happy to see somebody that really got it. It was like, yeah, it's great. And so just as a fellow entrepreneur, I'm still working on my other company. I was like, hey, let me know if you want any intros to investors. I can help you with your deck. It was just being helpful because, we're in like a co-working space and like, that's sort of the vibe there is you just help each other out when you can and make intros. So yeah, I offered that up and did make some intros to people who actually ended up investing. So
we should say the guy's name was
which guy?
The pitch deck, the person you met at the Workspace.
Oh, Yaniv Tal.
Yeah.
Yes.
An important part of the whole narrative is you bumped into you.
Yeah. So it was one of those fateful.
Yeah. Another
fateful moment in life where right place, right time. And so then later, like in December, Jannis and Brandon came out and it was like the first time that they had met Jannis in person. So they came to the space and I met them and they were working on things. So yeah, I was fortunate to like be there early days. And then, yeah, so this was around Christmas time. And then a few months later, ended up exiting business. And I was kind of thinking about, what I wanted to do next. And there's a little sidebar here I want to mention. So, so my wife and I took a little weekend trip to Palm Springs and I'd never been there. So we're sitting by the pool and she is listening to this audiobook called The Success Principles by Jack Canfield. He's this guy who wrote Chicken Soup for the Soul. And there's a chapter in it called 30 things or something like that. And basically you do this exercise where you write down 30 things you want to be, do, or have in your lifetime, but you do it like stream of consciousness, no filter, no censoring or saying like that idea is too big. Like you write down like your biggest, greatest dreams. And that's all you do. You just kind of like put it down and then kind of release it and just kind of watch what happens. It's sort of like putting this intention out to the universe. So my wife's like, yeah, we should do this. And I was like, great. Yeah, let's do it. So we do this like whole exercise and we share what we've written down with each other and a lot of things like match up. And so I was like, hey, let's go to Joshua Tree. I'd never been to Joshua Tree and we're like, okay, let's do it. So we drive up to Joshua Tree and if you've ever been to Joshua Tree, it's just like this mystical, magical place. Like I don't want to get too woo, but there's like alien vibes there, like the plants and the rocks. And it's just like,
there's an energy
there. So we like drive through and just have this like mystical experience, like driving through, sun was setting. And it was just like this weird, it was like entering this portal. And so we come out and then one of the things I'd written down was like, I want to flow into like into what I do next, like effortlessly, and just have it, super successful. And the next day out of the blue, I was like, hey, I'm going to text Yaniv and see what's going on. And so I was like, hey,
how much time had passed?
So this was around March. Okay. So I had met him in like November, December. So this is a few months later, but we had, seen each other on occasion still at Galvanize. But then kind of randomly, I'm like, hey, what's going on with your project? Like, I'm kind of free. I'm looking for my next thing. He's like, as luck would have it, we just got our first check, and like, why don't you come, and we need a community guy. Like, why don't you come work for us? I was like, sweet, I'm in. So that was like one of the things I had written down. And then on Monday, my wife gets a call from her friend who's a realtor, and she's like, Gabby, you got to come look at this house. And we had been living in the city, and she'd been looking for a place for like 3 years. She wanted to move out of the city. She's super into real estate and interior design, and like had never found the right place. She goes Monday, like walks in this house. She's like, this is it. And that was one thing she had written down, like in her 30 things, right? Like, I want to find like our forever home and da da da. So anyway, Monday rolls around, and like by Friday we had an offer in, and like bought it. Like it was like fast close because like 5 other people were wanting the house. We had to move fast. So that was just like, what we, being like spiritual woo people were like, oh, that 30, the 30 things exercise of
starting to manifest.
Writing. Yeah. Just starting to manifest like your dreams, and like not putting like ceilings on what you can accomplish. So it was like a magical experience for both of us. And subsequently, a lot of the other things that we had written down have like subsequently like happened. So, I do recommend that exercise to our listeners to like try it out. It's actually a really powerful thing. And we've taken groups out to like weekend experiences and done that exercise, and people had really good, really powerful experiences out of doing that. So that's a cool little manifestation trick I learned. So yeah, started first as like community lead, and I set up like the Discord and the Telegram, and
was there a community at this time?
No.
I mean, your employee.
No, it was like shouting to the wind, like, "Hey, we're here!"
Sure. But Jannis is working from Germany.
Jannis was in Germany.
You, Brandon, and you were in San Francisco.
Brandon was in East Bay, so he would come out like on occasion. He wasn't there every day. But yeah, me and Yaniv would go in every day to Galvanize. He was living like across the street at the time, so he would just walk over.
And this is super early stage. Nobody really knows quite what the graph is yet. So what are you prioritizing?
So it was at this time they brought on another guy, Arsini, at the time, who was a smart contract developer. And then I think soon after that, Ford came on. And so they were working on like a proof of concept at that time. It was really Jannis that was doing like the heavy lifting of like building, I think, the core of what is graph. Essentially like built the indexer, kind of single-handedly almost. And then early days, I think maybe May. So I started March, maybe around May, there was EdCon, which was in Waterloo or in Toronto. It was a conference. So he and I went. We didn't have a booth. We just went to like meet people and like talk.
Is this your first Web3 conference? First
Web3 conference. It's really interesting. A lot of the people that are still in the space were still there. That conference, I met Rick Burton. Shout out to Rick, and like a lot of great people that are still around.
And very early days for the industry. Yeah. What are those first contacts with the market like?
Thank you for listening to part 1 of my 2-part series with Rodrigo Coelho, Chief Spirit Officer at Edge & Node, and be sure to tune in next week for part 2. This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTIQ
Podcast.